Good evening and welcome to Sunday Night Bible Study with Pastor Josiah Shipley. It is August 16th. We're halfway through August now, and we are in the middle of studying a biography of the Apostle Paul. Last week we went over his conversion. We're going to be a little out of order this week. This week we're going to do his life before his conversion. Next week we'll do his life after his conversion, i.e. his mission trips. So I didn't know exactly what direction I was going to take it, but last week I wanted to make sure everyone had a baseline of the conversion experience of Paul. So this week we're going to talk for a little while about who he was before his conversion. Next week we'll talk about who he was after his conversion. Because keep in mind, guys, if someone gets saved, gets converted, and there's no change between their life before and their life after, no change at all, no conviction, no repentance, no holiness, that person wasn't saved, because if any man be in Christ, he's a new creature. Old things have passed away, behold, all have become new. 2 Corinthians 5:17. So, a couple announcements and we'll jump in. Don't forget to subscribe to Witten Media Ministry on YouTube. We've been getting some new subscribers. Guys, that really helps our ministry. It shows up on more people's pages with the algorithms on YouTube and Facebook, so keep that in mind. Of course, like us on Facebook, Witten Baptist Church. But we're really trying to promote Facebook and YouTube, so even if you don't use those, just go on there and like and subscribe just to help us out. Don't forget our wow moments on Thursday nights, our Monday morning timeouts with Pastor Ben, Tuesday night Bible studies with Pastor Jeff, hymn histories on Wednesdays. We had a really awesome one a couple weeks ago with Brother Bill. That was awesome. It's called I Have Been Redeemed. And then Saturday we have question and answer sessions. I hope you guys are liking those. We've been doing live for a few months now, interactive. Hope you liked yesterday's. I hope those are going well. Okay, so here are our four main passages for today. I'm going to go ahead and give them to you at the front. So for those of you that watch this and take notes, I'm going to go ahead and give you those passages at the front. Let me know if this helps. The first one is Acts chapter 22. A lot of Acts chapter 22, but Acts chapter 22. The second one is Philippians chapter 3, verses 4 through 6. The third one is Acts chapter 5, 33 through 39. And the fourth one is Galatians 1:14. Galatians 1:14. All right, so we're going to start in Acts chapter 22. Keep in mind, Luke wrote the book of Acts. The only Gentile we know of that wrote books of the Bible, wrote two of them actually. All right, Luke chapter 22. And the first thing I want you to know about Paul before his conversion, first off, he was also called Saul. If you go read Acts 13, it says Saul, who was also called Paul. We often say that Jesus changed Saul's name to Paul. That may be an odd way of putting it, because Acts 13 says Saul, who was also called Paul. It's more likely that Saul was a Hebrew pronunciation of it and Paul was a Latin or Roman pronunciation of it. I could be wrong about that, but that just seems more logical to me. At any rate, it is very clear that he preferred Paul, because all 13 of his letters he signed Paul, not Saul. But Saul was his original name, his Hebrew name, if you want to think of it that way. He's from the tribe of Benjamin. There was another Saul from the tribe of Benjamin, King Saul, which is who Saul would have been named after. Alright, so keep in mind, since we know the Bible wasn't originally written in chapter and verse format, even though we're reading Acts 22, the passage we're reading actually starts in chapter 21, verse 39. So if you have a Bible, it's just above it. If you have a phone, you have to flip back. But we're actually going to start in chapter 1, verse 39, and read through 22, verse 5. So again, we're going to start in chapter 21, verse 39, and read through 22, verse 5. Here we go. Paul replied, I am a Jew from Tarsus in Cilicia, a citizen of no obscure city. I beg you, permit me to speak to the people. And when he had given him permission, Paul, standing on the steps, motioned with his hand to the people, and there was a great hush. He addressed them in the Hebrew language, saying, Brothers and fathers, hear the defense I now make before you. And when they heard he was addressing them in the Hebrew language, they became even more quiet. And he said, I am a Jew, born in Tarsus in Cilicia, but brought up in this city, educated at the feet of I always say this wrong, Gamaliel, according to the strict manner of the law of our fathers, being zealous for God, as all of you are this day. I persecuted this way to the death, binding and delivering to prison both men and women, as the high priests and the whole council of elders can bear witness. From them I received letters to the brothers, and I journeyed toward Damascus to take those who were there and bring them in bonds to Jerusalem to be punished. Alright, I always pronounce his teacher's name right. I need Brother Bill to help me. Few things here, guys. First off, Paul was born in Tarsus, but raised in Jerusalem. Tarsus was no obscure city. This wasn't a small city. It's in Asia Minor on the far eastern side. Modern-day Turkey, far east. I don't have a map. Maybe 300 miles north of Jerusalem. So a long way away for those times. So he was raised there, but he was born in Tarsus, but he was raised in Jerusalem because, as we'll find out in a minute, his parents sent him to be a student under Gamaliel. I wish I could say his name right. Gamaliel. I'm going to say Gamaliel, who was one of the most well-known Jewish teachers at that time. We'll talk more about him in just a minute. So, born in Tarsus, raised in Jerusalem under strict teaching of rabbinic code, and then he grew up and then got letters from the high priest. This was what we read last week in Acts chapter 8, 9, to persecute the church. Alright, he was born of the tribe of Benjamin. I'm going to flip over real quick to Philippians 3, 4 through 6. Philippians 3, 4 through 6. This is some more insight. This is Paul writing about his own past. Philippians 3, 4 through 6. Though I myself to have reason to have confidence in the flesh, if anyone else thinks he has reason for confidence in the flesh, I have more. Circumcised on the 8th day, of the people of Israel, of the tribe of Benjamin, a Hebrew of Hebrews, as to the law a Pharisee, as to zeal persecuting the church, as to righteousness under the law blameless. But whatever was a gain to me, I have counted as a loss for the sake of Christ. Indeed, I count everything as loss in view of the surpassing worth of knowing Christ Jesus my Lord. For his sake I have suffered the loss of all things and count them as rubbish, in order I may gain Christ. I had to read through verse 8. It's just beautiful. So guys, Paul was a real deal Hebrew. He was a Hebrew of Hebrews. He's from one of the southern tribes, tribe of Benjamin. Paul was also a Roman citizen. Okay? Now, later on, 300 years later, the emperor is going to make all freed people Roman citizens. But at this time, it meant something if you were a Roman citizen. Back in Acts 22, verse 25 through 30, Paul is getting flogged, and he tells the Roman citizen, it's not legal for you to flog a Roman citizen. And they realized he was a Roman citizen. And the tribune said, I bought this citizenship for a large sum. But Paul said, I'm a citizen by birth. So Paul did not buy his citizenship. He was born into it. So we have to ask, how did his family become citizens? Well, there's a few theories on that. Let me give you a few. Number one, it's possible that his family purchased it. They were tent makers, like he was most likely. We know that he was a tent maker. It's actually how he helped make his living. Whenever churches couldn't support his mission work on their own, he would make tents. Priscilla and Aquila, it appears, bonded with them over this very fact that they were tent makers as well. Well, guys, that wouldn't have been a low-income, lower-class thing. That would have been a middle-class job, something people needed, was in high demand. Sometimes we have a little warped view. I'm not saying, for example, Paul made a killing tent making, but same thing with Jesus and Joseph. A carpenter would not have been a dirt poor person. That would have been middle class. That's a skill. Sometimes we think, but they couldn't, there was no room at the inn, so they had to do the whole manger thing, but they were traveling. That wasn't their home. They were traveling to Bethlehem. I was listening to something about that recently. Other ways you could get your citizenship, it's possible. If you did special service in the military, sometimes they would grant you citizenship for you and your whole family. Okay, one of our church fathers, a couple of them, Jerome being one of them, a couple centuries later, writes that they believed Paul's family, his father, grandfather, all them, were carried as prisoners of war from Gishgala to Tarsus and served as slaves to a Roman citizen. After they worked off their debt, if you want to think of it that way, after they worked off their slavery, prisoners of war, they were granted freedom and citizenship, and thus Paul was born into a freed family and a citizenship family. That's according to one of our church fathers. Doesn't make it biblical, doesn't make it necessarily true. Could have been any number of these things, we don't know. What's probable is that Paul probably came from money. Paul's family was probably well off by the time Paul was born. They may not have been. They may have come as prisoners of war or whatever. But they were probably well off by the time he was born. And we know that even more because they sent him 300 miles south to Jerusalem to be trained under maybe the most well-known Jewish teacher at the time, Gamaliel. A little bit about Gamaliel. He was a Pharisee. Let's read Acts 5. This tells us, this is our best biblical account of Gamaliel. Acts chapter 5, I'm going to start in verse 33. This is 33 through 39. When they heard this, they were enraged. This is the Sanhedrin, by the way. When they heard this, they were enraged and wanted to kill them. But a Pharisee in the council named Gamaliel, a teacher of the law, held in honor by all the people, stood up and gave orders to put the men outside for a little while. And when he said this to them, Men of Israel, take care that what you're about to do with these men. For before these days, Theodius rose up, claiming to be somebody, and a number of men, about 400, joined him. He was killed, and all who followed him were dispersed and came to nothing. After him, Judas the Galilean rose up in the days of the census, and drew some of the people away after him. He too perished, and all followed him were scattered. Verse 38. So in this present case, I tell you, keep away from these men and let them alone. For if this plan or this understanding is of man, it will fail. But if it's of God, you will not be able to overthrow them. You might even be found opposing God. So they took his advice. Alright, so Peter and John are in jail. I believe this is where the Sanhedrin, as well as, a party of the Sadducees, the captain, the council. Okay, and so this is probably the Sanhedrin, but at least is the council. I may have been wrong about that part. At either rate, we have Sadducees and Pharisees there. And we'll talk about the difference in a second. They're enraged. Gamaliel is able to stand up and give advice saying, guys, I don't know if this is of God or not, but if it is, I don't want to fight against it. So let's just let this play out. And they listen to him. That's a lot of pull if you're able to stop a whole council of angry people and convince them to not follow through with something that in their anger they want to do. We read from the Mishnah, which is oral traditions of the Pharisees, that Gamaliel was one of the 13 most influential Jewish teachers in this time. He may be the most well-known Jewish teacher in the world at this moment, and Paul's family paid for Paul to be taught by him. Now, I am not saying Gamaliel was a Christian. He probably was not. He definitely was not when he taught Paul. Right here, I'm not saying this is his conversion. All I'm saying is he at least took time to heed if this was of God, even though they were talking about Jesus. That says something. Okay, now, let's talk about the difference between Pharisees and Sadducees. The Pharisees, we talked a little bit about last week, were the ultra-conservative group of Jews, and the Sadducees, think of them as kind of like the, left-wing liberal. That's probably not the best way to put it, but let me explain it this way. The Pharisees believed you had to follow strict adherence to the law in order to receive salvation. You had to obey it perfectly. The Sadducees were not really about following the whole law. Well, yeah, God said this, but of course the Pharisees followed the law and missed the whole part about Jesus, and they added to the law a lot and made that God's law. They taught as the doctrines of men, and they taught God's law. They also taught man's law and said it was God's law. Does that make sense? The Sadducees didn't believe in a resurrection, the soul. They didn't believe in any of that. And when I said the resurrection, I don't just mean the resurrection of Jesus. They didn't believe in the resurrection of our bodies on that day, even though Daniel 12:2 says so. They didn't believe what Daniel said in chapter 12. So pay careful attention to which group of Jews are asking Jesus questions in the Gospels. So the Sadducees, since they don't believe in the resurrection, in Matthew 22:31, they come up and ask him, trying to trick him. Hey Jesus, if this woman had 7 husbands, who's she going to be married to in heaven, since you believe they're all going to be resurrected up? Jesus knew their hearts and knew their sarcastic question, and said, have you not read what God spoke to you through Moses? Now, we've talked about that verse a lot. Just keep that in mind. He quotes Moses from 1,500 years earlier and said, have you not read what God spoke to you? Because it still applies to them today. Just like this Bible right here was written 2,000 years ago, 3,000 years ago, still applies to us today, and it's God speaking to us now. And by the way, the answer basically was, we don't marry in heaven just like the angels don't. So the Pharisees are normally going to ask questions like, well, how do you follow this law if you do this? And what about this law? And Jesus is like, well, most of that's tradition. That's not God's law anyway. The Sadducees always ask questions about the resurrection of the dead because they don't believe in it. So, Gamaliel was a Pharisee, strict adherence to the law. And Paul believed he was obeying God by persecuting Christians. As he was being taught by Gamaliel, a couple things to keep in mind. Galatians 1:14. For you have heard of my former life in Judaism, how I persecuted the church of God violently and tried to destroy it. And I was advancing in Judaism beyond many of my own age among my people. So extremely zealous was I for the traditions of my father. Verse 15. But when he who had set me apart before I was born, who called me by his grace, was pleased to reveal his Son to me, in order that I might preach him among the Gentiles, I did not immediately consult with anybody. Paul, was doing so good under Gamaliel, he was advancing beyond many of his contemporaries. He was a rising star in Judaism. He was following the law. He was following man's law that was taught as God's law. He was doing all of it. But when God got a hold of him, all that changed. So, guys, Saul would have been doing what he thought was God's work. He would have been a good Christian boy, a good church boy, but he wasn't saved. Our pastor Jeff always says all the time, sitting in church doesn't make you a Christian any more than standing in the garage makes you a car. Just because Saul did all the right things and he memorized books of the Bible, but he didn't really believe in his heart. You see, God, he believed in God, but he didn't want to follow everything God said. He wasn't Lord of his life. Saul taught man's law. All these extra laws about how many steps you can take and all this stuff, all these different laws that aren't found in the Bible, he was teaching and saying they're God's law. That's legalism. Legalism is making anything God's law that's not God's law. Alright, so in summary, Saul was born in Tarsus but raised in Jerusalem under the tutelage of Gamaliel, one of the most well-known Jewish teachers in the entire world at that time. Paul's family probably had money. Paul was from the tribe of Benjamin, which is where King Saul is from. That's where his name's from. We're not exactly sure how his family became citizens, but that's okay. We know that Paul was born into it. We know that the Pharisees were the ones who wanted strict adherence to God's law and to their own law, which they said was God's law. The Sadducees did not believe in a resurrection or of a soul. We know that Paul was very zealous. Paul was very zealous. He was, what am I trying to say? Very strict in teaching man's law as God's law. And if you didn't follow it, he believed it was his right. And he believed it was even God's will to have you arrested and killed. We see that he was very pleased to see Stephen stoned in Acts chapter 7. As far as how old he would have been anywhere between his late 20s and early 30s at his conversion. That's about as far as we know. Alright, last thing on this and we'll be done. Physical description of Paul. Well, you know what? We'll get to the physical description next week. We'll get to the physical description next week when we talk about Paul after his salvation. Okay. So, I think we're good on this one. Yeah, I think we're good. Alright, guys. There's a little bit on Saul, who would be called Paul. I hope this was helpful. I hope you learned something. Next week we'll talk about Paul after his conversion and some of his mission trips. Alright, I love you guys very much. I hope you have a great rest of your evening. Tune in for Pastor Van's Timeout tomorrow morning.